Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Always great to be back.
This week, we're going to dive into a particularly interesting week in World War II.
Okay.
December 4th to the 10th, 1939.
All right.
We've got a lot to cover this week. We're going to be looking at the Winter War.
Yes.
The Battle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And all the diplomacy going on the world stage.
You know, what really strikes me about this week is how it already shows just how global this war is. We're going to see how events that were happening thousands of miles apart were actually really interconnected.
Yeah.
Influencing each other in ways that may not have been immediately apparent.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's start with the Winter War.
Okay.
It's December in Finland. I can only imagine just surviving the elements would be a challenge,
Yes.
let alone fighting a war.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
December 4th saw a massive snowstorm hit Finland.
Wow.
And basically brought everything to a standstill. And this actually gave the Finnish troops a much-needed break because they were able to use this time to kind of regroup and fortify their defenses.
And meanwhile, the Soviets were having a bit of a harder time dealing with the conditions.
Right.
Because hadn't they gone into this conflict vastly overestimating their own capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, the Soviets did have a significant advantage in terms of manpower and weaponry.
Sure.
What they didn't really account for was the Finns' resilience.
Okay.
Their tactical brilliance and their intimate knowledge of the terrain.
And of course, the Mannerheim Line.
Right.
And this was a crucial part of the Finnish defense strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Mannerheim Line was this network of fortifications that was built across the Karelian Isthmus.
Right.
And it was specifically designed to slow down a Soviet advance.
Yeah.
And slow them down it did.
Yeah.
The Finns really used the terrain to their advantage. They strategically placed their artillery.
Wow.
And they utilized some really innovative tactics to inflict heavy casualties on the attacking Soviet forces.
Yeah, it really seemed like the Finns excelled at using limited resources to maximum effect.
Right.
Like the Battle of Suomussalmi, for instance.
Yes.
They lured the Soviets into a trap and then used their knowledge of the frozen lakes to launch this devastating counterattack.
Suomussalmi is a perfect example of how the Finns were able to turn the Soviets' numerical superiority against them.
Yep.
By deliberately abandoning the pound, they drew the Soviets into this vulnerable position.
I see.
Then they used their superior mobility on skis and understanding of the frozen landscape to launch a surprise attack.
Wow.
Which divided the Soviet forces and inflicted heavy losses.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really
There are
did.
Finns using frozen lakes as their battleground.
Yeah.
Were there other examples of this kind of tactical ingenuity in the Winter War?
Absolutely. The battles at Kola and Rate Road are other prime examples of how the Finns used their knowledge of the terrain and the harsh winter conditions to their advantage.
Okay.
They were masters of camouflage, utilizing white uniforms and skis to move swiftly and silently through the snow-covered forests, and often appearing out of nowhere to ambush Soviet columns.
It's such a classic David versus Goliath scenario.
Yeah.
But even with these victories, the Finns weren't without their setbacks.
Yeah.
Soviets did manage to make some territorial gains during this week.
Yeah, despite all their struggles, the Soviets did capture the islands of Sur and Pien-Taipusari in the Gulf of Finland. These were relatively minor victories in the grand scheme of things, but they did show the Soviets' determination to gain a foothold in the region. But the Finns responded by fortifying the strategically important Åland Islands, which signaled their resolve to prevent further Soviet naval advances.
So while the Winter War was raging on land, there was a completely different kind of battle unfolding in the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right. This is where we start to see the war's global impact really starting to take shape. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it came to be known, was this relentless struggle for control of the sea lanes.
And the Germans were using a rather unconventional weapon in this fight.
Yes.
The U-boat.
U-boats or submarines were a relatively new weapon at this point.
Okay.
And they were proving to be incredibly effective at disrupting Allied shipping. This week, we saw U-boats sinking ships from Norway, Estonia, even neutral Denmark.
Wow.
Really emphasizing how far-reaching the war's impact on global trade already was.
And it wasn't all smooth sailing for the Germans, was it? They did suffer a rare loss this week with the sinking of the U-36.
Yeah, the sinking of the U-36 was a bit of an anomaly.
Okay.
It was actually sunk by a British submarine.
Oh, wow.
The HMS Salmon, in what amounted to a rare undersea duel.
Wow.
This type of engagement was pretty uncommon in submarine warfare, which typically relied on stealth and surprise.
And then there was the incident involving the HMS Nelson.
Oh, yes.
The pride of the British fleet.
Yes.
To have their flagship crippled by a mine must have been a major blow.
The HMS Nelson was a powerful battleship, and its loss, even temporarily, was a significant setback for the Royal Navy.
I see.
The fact that it was disabled by a mine rather than in direct combat underscored these hidden dangers lurking beneath the waves.
Yeah.
Mines were a constant threat,
Okay.
capable of crippling even the most formidable warships.
Right.
This incident served as a reminder of the constant vigilance required in naval warfare.
And speaking of stealth and surprise, we can't forget about the German commerce raider, the Admiral Graf Spee.
Ah, the Admiral Graf Spee. A true wolf in sheep's clothing. It was disguised as this harmless passenger ship, but it was actually a heavily armed warship tasked with disrupting Allied shipping. This week, the Graf Spee continued its rampage across the South Atlantic, sinking several Allied merchant vessels.
Wow.
It even managed to slip past a British cruiser squadron before finally heading towards Montevideo for what its captain hoped would be a safe harbor.
Right.
Little did he know a trap was being set.
Yeah, this sets the stage for one of the most dramatic naval encounters of the early war.
Yes.
The Battle of the River Plate.
Exactly.
But before we get there, I think it's important to note that the Battle of the Atlantic was more than just a series of isolated naval engagements.
Absolutely.
It was this struggle for control of the sea lanes.
Yes.
Vital for supplying Britain and its allies with the resources they needed to fight the war.
Right. Absolutely.
It seems like every corner of the world was being touched by the war in some way.
Yes.
Even in these early months.
Absolutely. And as we'll see, the war's impact on the political landscape was just as profound as its impact on the battlefields.
While these dramatic naval battles were unfolding, the political landscape was also shifting pretty dramatically. This week, we see nations maneuvering for position, alliances being tested, and the battle for public opinion intensifying.
Yeah, the Soviet Union, facing mounting international criticism for their invasion of Finland, was particularly active on the diplomatic front this week. They launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign attempting to control the narrative and justify their actions.
And their denials of bombing Finnish cities were particularly brazen, weren't they? Especially considering the evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, the Soviets claimed they weren't actually at war with Finland.
Oh, really?
They claimed they were providing assistance to this puppet government that they had installed, the so-called Finnish Democratic Republic, which was led by Otto Kuusinen.
It seems like a rather transparent attempt to legitimize their invasion.
It does, doesn't it?
Did anyone actually believe this?
Well, the international community largely saw through this facade. The League of Nations, though weakened by its inability to prevent the war, did attempt to address the conflict. However, the Soviet Union simply refused to participate in the League's proceedings, demonstrating a blatant disregard for international diplomacy.
It's interesting how this conflict really exposed the limitations of the League of Nations.
It did. The League's failure to effectively intervene in the Winter War further eroded its credibility on the world stage, foreshadowing its eventual demise.
Meanwhile, Germany, under Hitler's leadership, was focusing on consolidating its power and preparing for a long war.
Yeah, Hitler recognized that this conflict was unlikely to be a quick victory, so he ramped up munitions production, ensured that German factories were operating at full capacity to churn out weapons, tanks, and aircraft.
And they also made a strategic move to secure vital oil supplies from Romania, didn't they? Despite the British blockade.
Yeah, securing access to Romanian oil fields was crucial for the German war effort. It showed their commitment to a long-term conflict and their ability to circumvent the British blockade.
It seemed like the Axis powers were a united front at this point. But were there any cracks beginning to show in their alliance?
Interestingly enough, there were hints of internal dissent, even in these early stages of the war.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Italo Balbo, who was a prominent Italian air marshal, openly criticized Mussolini's alliance with Hitler.
What were his concerns?
He argued that the alliance would ultimately subordinate Italy's interests to those of Germany and predicted that Italy would become a mere satellite state. This was a pretty bold and risky move, considering Mussolini's iron grip on power.
It's fascinating to see how these internal tensions were already simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah, these early signs of dissent highlight the inherent complexities and fragility of alliances, even those forged in the crucible of war.
Across the Atlantic, the United States, though officially neutral,
Yes.
was also grappling with the war's implications.
Hmm.
There were strong pro-Nazi sentiments in certain segments of American society at this time, weren't there?
Yes. Groups like the German-American Bund,
Okay.
led by Fritz Julius Kuhn,
Yep.
openly espoused pro-Nazi ideology and attempted to stir up support for Hitler's regime. However, their influence was limited, and the U.S. government was becoming increasingly wary of their activities.
And Kuhn was sentenced to prison this week on corruption charges.
Mm-hmm.
This must have been a significant blow to the Bund's efforts.
Kuhn's conviction was a clear signal that the U.S. government was determined to crack down on pro-Nazi activities and foreign interference in domestic affairs. It also highlighted the growing tension between American ideals of democracy and freedom and the totalitarian ideology of Nazi Germany.
And while these political and ideological battles were playing out, the horrors of the Holocaust were already beginning to unfold in occupied Poland.
Right.
This week, we see the chilling use of the Zikanka Psychiatric Hospital for experimenting with mobile gas chambers.
The Zikanka Psychiatric Hospital, under the direction of this SS officer named Herbert Lange, became a horrifying testing ground for methods of mass killing. Lange experimented with mobile gas fans,
Oh, wow.
using carbon monoxide to murder mentally disabled patients.
These early atrocities mark a dark turning point in the war.
Yes.
A descent into unimaginable cruelty and barbarity.
It's a stark reminder that this war wasn't just a conflict between nations, but a battle between ideologies.
Right.
A struggle for the very soul of humanity.
It's a chilling thought, knowing that these horrific events were taking place even as the world was focused on the more conventional battles of the war.
It's a reminder that we must always be vigilant against the forces of hatred and intolerance, no matter how seemingly insignificant they may appear.
While the world's attention was largely focused on the events unfolding in Europe, it's important to remember that other conflicts were raging simultaneously.
Right.
The Second Sino-Japanese War, now in its third year, continued to claim countless lives and devastate vast regions of China.
The fighting in China this week saw Japanese forces making advances in South Guangxi, capturing strategic locations, and solidifying their control over vital supply routes. However, the Chinese resistance remained resolute, launching counteroffensives and inflicting heavy losses on the Japanese in other areas.
It's a testament to the Chinese people's resilience and determination to resist Japanese aggression.
Their unwavering spirit in the face of overwhelming odds is a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the enduring desire for freedom.
This week, we also saw the British government growing increasingly frustrated with neutral countries for not doing enough to support their blockade of Germany.
Yeah, the British blockade was a crucial element of their war strategy, aimed at weakening Germany's war machine by cutting off vital supplies. However, its effectiveness depended on the cooperation of other nations.
It seems like the British were facing a dilemma.
Yeah.
They needed the support of neutral countries to maintain the blockade, but these countries were reluctant to get involved, fearing German retaliation.
Right. It highlights that delicate balance of power and those complex calculations involved in wartime diplomacy.
In a small but significant gesture of support for Finland, the United States granted them a $10 million credit for agricultural supplies.
Okay.
That was pretty nice of them.
This act of humanitarian aid, while modest in scale, symbolized the growing international sympathy for Finland's plight and the condemnation of Soviet aggression. It also hinted at the potential for future U.S. involvement in the conflict, though that remained uncertain at this point.
This week, in December 1939, really paints a vivid picture of a world at war.
Yes.
A world grappling with complex political and moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
And a world on the brink of even greater upheaval.
It was a week where the lines between good and evil became increasingly blurred, where the horrors of war were juxtaposed with acts of courage and compassion, and where the fate of nations, and indeed the very future of humanity, hung precariously in the balance.
It's incredible to think that all of this happened in just 1 week. It really shows how quickly the world was changing in those early months of the war.
Yeah, and it wasn't just on the battlefields and in the halls of power. You know, this week also saw individuals making these incredible journeys and taking courageous stands, further demonstrating the war's impact on people from all walks of life.
Yeah, for example, we saw a number of Polish pilots who had escaped the Nazi invasion of their homeland, making their way to Britain.
Right. These pilots, already experienced in aerial combat against the Luftwaffe, were determined to continue the fight against Nazi tyranny. Their arrival in Britain would prove to be a significant boost to the Royal Air Force, bolstering its ranks with skilled and highly motivated airmen.
It's inspiring to see that even in the face of such adversity,
Yeah.
these individuals refuse to give up hope.
Their determination to fight for freedom, even after losing their own country, is a testament to the human spirit's resilience.
And then there's a story of Sir Stafford Cripps, a British politician who embarked on a mission to India this week. What was the purpose of his visit?
Well, Cripps' mission was to engage with Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah,
In an attempt to secure India's support for the war effort.
I imagine that was a pretty complex and delicate negotiation,
Right.
given India's own struggle for independence from British rule.
Absolutely. India's nationalist movement was gaining momentum at this point.
Yeah.
And there was this strong sentiment for self-rule. Cripps' task was to find a way to reconcile India's aspirations for independence with Britain's need for its support in the war.
It seems like this week, in December 1939, really encapsulated so many of the key themes and struggles of World War II. The brutality of the fighting, the shifting alliances, the moral complexities, and the stories of individual courage and resilience.
I think you're right. It was a week that highlighted the war's truly global nature,
Yeah.
its impact on every aspect of life, from the battlefield to the political arena, and from the individual to the international stage. And as we've seen, the events of this week set the stage for even greater challenges and triumphs to come. The Battle of the River Plate was looming on the horizon, the outcome of the Winter War remained uncertain, and the world was bracing for what the new year would bring.
Yeah, it was a time of great uncertainty and upheaval, but also a time that showcased the best of humanity. The courage to resist tyranny, the compassion to help those in need, and the determination to fight for a better future.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this week of December 4th to the 10th, 1939. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives and experiences of individuals who lived through these extraordinary times. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the stories of the past alive.